Welcome to Books on Point. Climate change affects us all, but it can be a confusing business. Three leading South African scientists who've worked on the issue for over 2 decades aim to help you make sense of this topic. Climate Change Briefings from Southern Africa takes the form of 55 frequently asked questions, each with a brief, clear, scientifically up-to-date reply. The 4 main sections take you through the science of how climate system works, the projected impacts in Southern Africa during the 21st century, what this means for South African society, and what can be done to avoid the harm. I had a conversation with one of the authors. Take a look. Bob, thank you so much for your time. The topic around climate change has really taken center stage over the past few years, but we also saw it pick up around the World Economic Forum. When you think climate leadership and you take into consideration the role of business, governments and NGOs, what comes to mind?
I think that the reality of climate change has really come home to roost in this year. People were making the right sort of statements for many years, but not actually doing very much about it. There were always more important or more urgent things to deal with, and it just fell off the table. Now it's becoming very hard to ignore, both in government and in the private sector, either because it's impacting their businesses directly, their supply chains, or because they're under enormous reputational pressure not to be contributing to the problem.
You wrote a book a couple of years ago, particularly honing in on climate change, focusing on Southern Africa and even touching on aspects around coal. When you look at the way South Africa and South Africa's leadership is dealing with climate change, what more can we do to raise awareness about some of the effects that are currently happening?
So Southern Africa is more than averagely exposed to the risks of climate change. That seems very unfair because we haven't been the dominant global cause of climate change. It's because of our location. We are squarely in the descending part of the Hadley cells. That's very technical, but that's basically why they call us sunny South Africa. So we naturally get a low rainfall, and that circumstance becomes more extreme as climate change intensifies.
Let's talk about the effects of climate change, particularly in Southern Africa. What's your view on that?
So awareness is actually reasonably high now. It's not always perhaps as well informed as it needs to be, but we get very low levels both within government and in the private sector of South Africa of outright denialism. People can see that the climate is changing, so people are sensitized to the issue. They just need to learn more about the specific details. The real gap in South Africa is between what we say we do and what we actually do, and this is not only for climate change. So we can't simultaneously be arguing in global forums that the world really needs to be aiming for a 1.5 degree target, stricter than the 2 degree target agreed in Paris, which we're not going to meet either, but at the same time, be committing ourselves to large coal investments in South Africa.
What do you think some of the major economies can do, in particular those from the developed markets, in terms of using their gravitas and their influence to be able to raise issues around climate change to a much higher level than we're seeing right now?
So I think that once these climate solutions start coming on stream, they will take over really quite rapidly. An example is electric cars. They are now just at the cusp where it's likely that in a decade's time, very few of us will be driving internal combustion cars. So once the economic circumstances are right and once the perception is correct, the uptake is in fact very rapidly, and that largely occurs through the private sector and the choices made by ordinary individuals rather than by legislation.
Is there a way to predict how long we have before we start seeing the catastrophic effects of climate change? Or are we at a point where we can turn things around a little bit if we start our efforts right now?
Yes, there are ways of doing that in the general but not the specific. So I cannot tell you that on the 12th of December in 2040 at 11 o'clock in the morning there is going to be a tornado, but we can establish the rate at which different risks increase over time. We have already crossed some of those tipping points. For instance, at this stage, it seems likely that the Greenland ice cap cannot be recovered. It will continue to melt, and that means we are committed worldwide to a multi-meters of sea level rise. over the long term, over a period of several centuries. We don't want to cross too many of those irreversible thresholds, and we watch those with great care. But in terms of the sort of everyday catastrophes, if you like, the sort of floods and tornadoes and fires that we've seen over the last year, we're already in that space.
This year we are going into COP26, and at this point it's the road to COP26. What are some of the issues that you're hoping will come out of that platform?
So one of the key issues that we're going to have to address is this problem of the global commons. So the atmosphere of the world and its oceans are not owned by any particular company or person or country. And when you have a situation like that, you get some dynamics around that, which means that there's a real disadvantage to be an aggressive early mover. It's better to just hang around and, ride on other people's coattails. But we understand that, and to address those kind of global commons problems, you have to work out a solution which required concerted collective action, where there are disincentives for being a freeloader and there are incentives to being an early adopter. And it's getting that formula right is what we need to do.
Well, our recommended self-help book for the week is titled Financial Freedom Through Property. It's a step-by-step practical guide on how to purchase your first investment property, written in an easy-to-understand conversational language that explains complex concepts simply. Property investment expert Lawrence Bull believes that with the right knowledge, anyone can make money in property regardless of the resources available to them. Well, that's it from me. I'll be back with you next week. We've got more news with Nompumelelo Siziba at the top of the hour. But for now, here are the details.